52,000 years ago, in the forests of what we now call Eastern Europe, a Neanderthal named Crag crouched in absolute silence. The moon hung low through the canopy. Mist clung to the ground like breath made visible. He could smell them before he saw them, a scent different from his own people, a sharper, carried on the wind from the south. Homo Sapiens. The newcomers, they were entering his territory, his hunting grounds. The valley where his family had lived for generations beyond counting. Crag's hand tightened on his spear. Around him, 5 hunters waited, invisible in shadow. They had done this 1,000 times before a bushing mammoth bear lion. But tonight was different. Tonight. They were hunting the most dangerous prey that ever walked the earth. Other humans. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, those humans were hunting them back. The valley Crag had chosen was perfect. He'd known it since childhood when his father first brought him here to learn the ways of the hunt. The limestone outcroppings rose on both sides like ancient sentinels, funneling everything that moved through a narrow corridor barely 60 feet across. The river ran swift and cold along the western edge, its sound masking footsteps, its presence forcing prey into predictable paths. Dawn was beginning to break. Fog pooled in the low places, thick as smoke. Crag positioned himself behind a massive boulder, worn smooth by 10,000 winters. From here, he could see the entire approach the game trail that wound between the rocks, scattered deadfall that would slow any retreat, the slight rise where the path narrowed to its tightest point. His hunting party spread out in practiced formation. 3 hunters on the high ground to the east, 2 more concealed in the brush to the west, near the river. This was the killing ground. The Neanderthals had lived in Europe for 350,000 years. Crag's ancestors had survived the advance and retreat of ice sheets that swallowed entire mountain ranges. They had outlasted volcanic winters that turned the sky black for years. They knew this land the way a man knows his own heartbeat, intimately, instinctively. Without thought, the Homo sapiens had arrived barely 5,000 years ago. Newcomers, invaders from the south, from the warm lands beyond the mountains. They moved through the forests like children, following obvious trails, camping in exposed valleys, making noise that could be heard for miles. Easy prey. Or so Crag had thought. Before the killings began, Crag's eyes swept the terrain one more time. His vision was sharp, even in the dim light sharper than the Homo sapiens possessed. The Neanderthal skull cradled larger eyes, adapted through millennia to Europe's dark forests and long winters. He could hunt at dawn and dusk when other predators struggled to see. It gave him an edge. Every advantage mattered now. The river's sound changed slightly. A rock displaced. Water splashing in a rhythm that wasn't natural. They were coming. Crag's breathing slowed. His pulse steadied. Around him, his hunters became stone. This was their gift, inherited from countless generations, the ability to read landscape, to predict movement, to position themselves perfectly in the one place prey would pass. Evidence from dozens of archaeological sites across Europe confirmed what Crag lived. Neanderthals returned to the same ambush locations again and again across generations. Certain valleys, certain caves, certain narrow passages. Knowledge passed from father to son, etched into memory deeper than words. A shape materialized through the fog. Then another. Then 6 more. 8 Homo sapiens. Moving in a loose group along the game trail, exactly as Crag predicted, they carried spears longer than Neanderthal weapons, balanced differently. Some bore strange wooden devices throwers that extended their reach. Crag had seen these before. Deadly at distance. Useless when the fighting turned close, and Crag would make sure it turned close. The Homo sapiens were talking. Low voices carrying through the morning air. Their language was different. More melodic, faster, filled with sounds Crag's throat couldn't quite shape. But he understood the tone. They were relaxed, confident. They thought themselves alone. The lead male was tall and lean, moving with the easy stride of someone who had never known true hunger. His face was narrow, his brow high and smooth. Nothing like Crag's heavy features, his pronounced ridge, his massive jaw. The Homo sapiens looked fragile, breakable. Cragg had thought that too once. Before he saw them fight, before he learned they were anything but fragile, the group entered the narrowest part of the passage. 40 feet separated them from Cragg's position. The bird calls had stopped. The forest held its breath. On the high ground, one of Cragg's hunters shifted position ever so slightly, preparing for the signal. Just a few more steps. The lead Homo sapiens paused. His head turned, scanning the rocks. For a moment, one terrible moment, his eyes seemed to look directly at Cragg's hiding place. Could he see through the shadows? Could he sense the trap? Then the moment passed. The man continued forward. His companions followed, 30 feet now. Cragg's muscles coiled. His spear felt weightless in his hands. The fire-hardened point was sharp enough to punch through ribs to find the heart beneath. He'd made this weapon himself, spending days selecting the right wood, shaping the shaft, binding the stone head with sinew soaked in animal fat. Every hunter made his own spear. Every hunter knew his weapon like he knew his own hands. 20 feet. The Homo sapiens were in the kill zone now. Boxed in by stone on both sides, the river at their backs, nowhere to run, Cragg rose from behind the boulder, and the forest exploded into violence. The spear in Cragg's hands weighed exactly as it should. 7 feet of carefully selected ashwood, fire-hardened at both ends. Balanced perfectly at the grip point, his calloused palm had worn smooth over years of use. The stone point was Lavala, flint razor sharp edges. Produced through a technique his people had perfected across thousands of generations. He'd hafted it himself 3 moons ago, binding it with braided sinew that had since shrunk and tightened in the cold. Holding the killing edge secure, this was his third spear. The first had broken in the chest of a cave lion. The second remained buried in the ribcage of a Homo sapiens warrior who died badly to winters past. Cragg's hands told stories. His right palm bore a thick scar where a spear shaft had splintered during a mammoth hunt, driving splinters deep into the muscle. 3 fingers on his left hand had been broken and healed crooked after a bison trampled him when he was young and stupid. The pinky finger on that same hand was missing, entirely bitten off by a wolf he'd killed with his bare hands when his spear lodged in a tree. These were the hands of a weapon maker, a killer. Hands that had held a spear since he was old enough to walk around him. His hunting party checked their weapons with the same methodical precision. Brock, his younger brother, carried a spear slightly longer than Cragg's, compensating for his lesser experience with greater reach. Tharn, their cousin, preferred a shorter weapon better for the close grappling he favored. Each hunter knew his tools the way birds know the air. But Neanderthal weapons were different from the elegant projectiles the Homo sapiens carried. Cragg had examined captured enemy spears after previous skirmishes. They were lighter, designed to be thrown from otlittles, those strange wooden levers that multiplied throwing distance. Homo sapiens could kill from 100 feet away, raining death from safety. Neanderthals had never developed such weapons. Their spears were for thrusting, for driving the point home from 15 feet, 10 feet, 5 feet away, for feeling the resistance of flesh and bone, for controlling the weapon through the kill, for withdrawing and striking again. It meant getting close. Dangerously close, the archaeological evidence was written in Neanderthal bones. Researchers examining thousands of skeletal remains from sites across Europe found injury patterns that told a brutal story. Neanderthal fossils showed healed fractures in the arms, shoulders, and skulls injuries that matched those found in modern rodeo riders, people who wrestled large animals at close range. Cracked ribs, broken collarbones, compressed vertebrae, skulls that had been struck and healed again. Every adult Neanderthal male bore the marks of close quarters violence. Cragg's weapon arsenal was simple. The primary spear, his life, his survival, the tool he trusted above all others. A secondary stone hand axe, tucked into a leather belt, its edge sharp enough to butcher a mammoth or split a human skull. A length of hardwood club worn smooth by use, weighted perfectly for crushing blows. And stones, selected for throwing, for smashing, for finishing wounded prey. No bows. No lots. No distance weapons at all. When Neanderthals fought, they fought close enough to smell fear. The tactics were simple because they had to be. Ambush from concealment. Close the distance before prey could react. Drive the spear into the vital areas: chest, neck, belly. Use overwhelming strength to power through any defense. If the spear broke or lodged, transition to hand axe or club. If those failed, use hands and teeth. Neanderthals were built to grapple, to wrestle, to bring opponents to the ground where superior strength became absolute advantage. Homo sapiens fought differently. They used terrain and distance. They coordinated complex group tactics. They threw spears from safety and retreated if pressed. They were faster, more agile, better at avoiding close combat. But if a Neanderthal got his hands on you, if he closed that final distance and brought you within reach of his terrible strength, fight was over. Crag ran his thumb along the flint, edge of his spear point, sharp enough to split a hair, sharp enough to slide between ribs like water. The binding was tight. The shaft was true. The weapon was ready. He was ready. The Homo sapiens group moved closer through the fog. Crag counted their weapons. 8 spears. For lots. Several carried stone knives. One had a wooden club similar to Neanderthal design. They were well armed. Experienced hunters? It wouldn't matter. Crag heard the first footfall on the game trail. Then another. The sound of leather against stone. The creak of weapons shifting. The breathing of men who thought themselves safe. He tightened his grip on his spear. The ash wood was warm from his hands. The weight felt right. Everything felt right. And then he heard something that made his blood turn to ice. One of the Homo sapiens was carrying something new. Something Crag had never seen before. A weapon that would change everything. Crag remembered the first time he killed a man. He'd been younger than barely 20 winters. Still learning the patterns of the hunt, his father had taken him to intercept a Homo sapiens scout who'd wandered too far into Neanderthal territory. The fight had been brief and terrible. The scout was fast, dancing back from Crag's first thrust, circling with his longer spear, looking for openings. Then Crag caught his wrist. The memory was seared into his mind. The feeling of his fingers closing around the Homo sapiens forearm. The crushing grip that made bones creak and grind. The scout's face had transformed from confidence to terror in a single heartbeat. He pulled back with all his strength, trying to break free. It was like a child pulling against an oak tree. Crag pulled him forward instead, into the spear, into the ending. That was when Crag understood the truth written into his bones. Neanderthals weren't just strong. They were catastrophically powerful in ways Homo sapiens could barely comprehend. The physiology was simple mathematics. Crag stood 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed nearly 200 pounds. Almost all of it muscle wrapped around bones dense as stone. His chest was a barrel, his shoulders massive, his arms thick as a Homo sapiens thigh. Where Homo sapiens had evolved for endurance, running across African plains, Neanderthals had evolved for explosive power in European forests. His skeleton was fundamentally different. Researchers examining Neanderthal remains found bone density 30% greater than modern humans, where Homo sapiens bones were like pine light, and flexible Neanderthal bones were like ironwood. Harder, heavier, nearly impossible to break without catastrophic force. The muscle attachment points told the rest of the story. Every bone in Crag's body showed pronounced ridges where muscles anchored massive deltoids. Crushing trapezius muscles, forearms like clubs. His hands could grip with force measured in the thousands of pounds per square inch. Strong enough to crack walnuts between thumb and forefinger. Strong enough to crush a human windpipe like crushing grass. Studies comparing Neanderthal skeletal structure to modern athletes suggested grip. Strength 2 to 3 times greater than even the strongest humans alive today. When Crag grabbed something, it stayed grabbed, but strength demanded fuel. Crag's body required 4,000 to 5,000 calories every single day, nearly twice what a Homo sapiens needed. Pure muscle was expensive. During times of plenty, when mammoth herds filled the valley and reindeer migrated in endless streams, Neanderthals thrived. Their power made them supreme predators. During times of scarcity, that same power became a death sentence. Crag's training had been brutal. Every Neanderthal boy learned to hunt young, but Craig's father had pushed him harder than most. Countless hours throwing spears until his shoulders screamed, wrestling with adults who showed no mercy, carrying stones uphill until his legs collapsed, learning to control the terrible strength that could tear meat from bone or accidentally crush the hand of a child who reached for his fingers. He'd watched boys fail the training, watched them break under the physical demands, watched them die during hunts because they lacked the strength to drive a spear home or the power to break free from a predator's grip. Only the strong survived to father children. Only the powerful passed their blood forward. And now that blood sang in Crag's veins as he prepared to strike. His breathing was controlled, his heart rate steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. His muscles had that warm, loose feeling that came before violence, relaxed but ready to explode into motion faster than thought. The cold air expanded his lungs. His vision was crystal clear. The Homo Sapiens group was 15 feet away now, close enough to smell a scent like smoke and strange spices, different from the musk of Neanderthal sweat. Close enough to see the weave of their leather clothing, the bone beads they wore. The paint some had applied to their faces in patterns Crag didn't understand. They looked fragile. Their bones were bird bones. Their muscles were lean and stringy. They moved with quick, nervous energy like prey animals, always ready to bolt. But Crag had learned to respect them. They were fragile the way a wolf was fragile, lighter, faster, able to coordinate in ways Neanderthals couldn't match. They made up for weakness with numbers and cunning. Still, when it came to raw killing power, there was no contest. Crag's muscles coiled like springs compressed to their limit. His hunting party waited for his signal, invisible in their positions. The Homo Sapiens reached the center of the kill zone, trapped between stone walls, boxed in. No escape routes. Crag rose from behind the boulder, spear raised. The Homo Sapiens' head snapped toward him, eyes wide, mouths opening to shout warnings. Too late. Crag's signal was a roar that tore from his chest, a sound like a bear. Like thunder, like death itself. And 5 Neanderthal hunters erupted from concealment like an avalanche of muscle and rage. 3 seconds before Crag gave the signal to attack, he had already decided which Homo sapiens would die first. The tall male in front, the one who moved with the confidence of a leader, who scanned the forest with eyes that missed nothing, who carried himself like someone who had survived many fights. That one was dangerous. That one would rally the others, would coordinate a defense, would turn panicked flight into organized resistance. That one had to die in the first 5 seconds. Crag's brain worked through the tactical problem with cold precision. 8 enemies, total. For males of fighting age, 3 females too looked strong enough to use weapons effectively. One was younger, barely more than a girl. One juvenile male, perhaps 12 or 13 winters. The lead male carried a spear and aught little. The second male, shorter, stockier than typical Homo sapiens, had a club. Interesting. More like Neanderthal tactics. The third male was injured, favoring his left leg. Easy target. The fourth hung back, watching the trees, nervous, smart. The females were spread through the group's center. Not fighters then, but not defenseless either. One carried a long knife. One had a spear. Crag cataloged their weapons, their positions, their body language, who moved with confidence, who showed fear, who watched the rocks, who watched the sky, who touched their weapons nervously, who held them like they knew how to use them. This was predator mathematics. The same calculation Crag made when stalking mammoth herds: which animal was weak, which was alert, which would panic first and trigger a stampede. Humans were just another animal. More clever, more dangerous, but ultimately predictable if you understood their patterns. The Neanderthal brain was built for this. Crag's skull housed a brain as large as any Homo sapiens, larger than most, in fact. 1,500 cubic centimeters of neural tissue. Evolved across hundreds of thousands of years to solve one primary problem: how to survive in the most hostile environment on Earth. But the structure was different. Evidence from fossil skulls showed that where Homo sapiens had developed larger frontal cortexes, the regions associated with abstract planning and social manipulation, Neanderthals had evolved. Massive visual cortexes and motor control centers. Cragg couldn't imagine the future in the complex, flexible ways Homo sapiens seemed to. He couldn't conceptualize vast social networks or long-term political strategies. But he could read terrain instantly, could predict movement patterns with uncanny accuracy, could coordinate his body with mechanical precision, could see in dim light, track subtle changes in his environment, process spatial information faster than conscious thought. The Homo sapiens led male stepped over a fallen log. His weight distribution was slightly off. His rear foot dragged just a fraction. Old injury to the hip, probably. It would slow his pivot, slow his ability to dodge or change direction. Cragg filed this away. The stocky male with the club kept touching his side. Broken ribs, maybe? Or internal injury that hadn't fully healed. Either way, weakness. Press the attack to his right side, force him to twist, exploit the pain. The nervous male in the back kept glancing over his shoulder, not watching the present moment. Divided attention. He'd be slowest to react. Cragg's people had language of that he was certain. The FOXP2 gene buried in his cells was the same genetic blueprint that allowed Homo sapiens to speak. He could form complex sounds, could string together words, could communicate abstract concepts. When his hunting party prepared for this ambush, they had discussed tactics in detail. Who would strike first? Who would block escape routes? What to do if the prey scattered or fought back? But Neanderthal language was likely simpler than the melodic, rapid-fire speech of Homo sapiens. More concrete, more focused on the immediate and physical, rather than the distant and conceptual. What Neanderthals had instead was something deeper. A shared understanding born from hunting together since childhood. Cragg didn't need to tell Brock which target to take. Didn't need to explain to Tharn when to cut off the escape route. They knew they'd practiced these movements hundreds of times. Their minds worked in parallel, synchronized through lifetime of cooperation. The Homo sapiens group moved deeper into the kill zone. And Cragg noticed something that changed everything. The lead male was carrying a weapon Cragg had never seen before. It looked like an autlot, but different, more refined. The shaft was straighter, the grip more ergonomic. The spear that rested in it was fletched with feather, something Neanderthals had never thought to do. And there was something else. A detail that made Cragg's predator brain suddenly scream warning. The lead male was scanning the rocks, not randomly, but systematically. Left to right, high to low. The way someone searches when they expect ambush. The way someone searches when they've survived ambushes before. Cragg's eyes locked with the Homo sapiens warrior across 30 feet of morning mist. And for one eternal second, predator recognized predator. Then Cragg roared and launched himself forward, and the killing began.
2 heartbeats before Cragg roared, his hand moved. It was a small gesture. 3 fingers extended, palm down, swept left to right. To anyone watching who didn't know the language, it would mean nothing. A man adjusting his grip. A nervous twitch before violence. To Brock. Crouched 30 feet away behind a limestone outcrop. It meant everything. The signal was older than words. Passed down through generations of hunters who had perfected the art of silent coordination. 3 fingers. 3 targets on the left flank. Palm down, low strike, go for legs first to cripple mobility. Sweep, left to right. Attack sequence from east to west. Flowing like water through the kill zone, Brock's hand flashed in response. 2 fingers, fist clenched. He'd take the second and third targets. Drive them toward Cragg. No mercy. Across the narrow valley, Tharn was already moving. Cragg hadn't signaled him, didn't need to. Tharn had hunted with Cragg since they were boys, learning to throw rocks at rabbits. He knew what his cousin would do before Cragg knew himself. Tharn would sweep wide right, cut off the river escape route. Drive any runners back into the spear points of the primary ambush line. This was the mathematics of Neanderthal hunting parties. 4 to 8 males, usually related by blood brothers, cousins, fathers and sons. Tight family bonds forged in childhood and tempered through decades of cooperative killing. Every successful hunt required perfect timing. A mammoth spooked 3 seconds too early would escape. A cave lion, warned by clumsy movement, would turn from prey to predator. The Homo sapiens fought differently. Cragg had watched them from a distance during previous encounters. Their groups were larger, sometimes 20 or 30 individuals. They coordinated through constant vocal communication, calling out positions and movements, adjusting tactics on the fly through rapid exchange of information. More flexible, more adaptive, more creative, but flexibility took time. Adaptation required thought. Creativity needed communication, and Cragg wasn't giving them 3 seconds, much less 30. His hunting party had rehearsed this ambush pattern since adolescence. The movements were carved into muscle memory deeper than conscious thought. When Cragg rose from concealment, 5 other Neanderthals would rise simultaneously from precisely calculated positions. When he thrust his spear, others would strike from angles that eliminated escape. When one hunter's weapon lodged in flesh or bone, another would already be moving to finish the kill. They were a single organism, a multi-bodied predator that thought with one mind. The evidence was written in Neanderthal burial sites across Europe. At Shanidar Cave, in what would one day be called Iraq, archaeologists discovered something remarkable. Neanderthal skeletons that showed catastrophic injuries sustained years before death. Crushed arms that had healed. Blinded eyes. Crippled legs. Men who couldn't hunt, couldn't gather, couldn't contribute to group survival, yet they had lived for years after their injuries. Someone fed them. Someone protected them. Someone cared. This was the foundation of Neanderthal hunting tactics. Absolute loyalty. Unbreakable bonds. The certainty that your brother would die for you, that your cousin would stand between you and death, that your hunting party would never leave you behind. When you fought alongside men who loved you more than life itself, you fought differently, harder, without fear of abandonment or betrayal. You took risks because you trusted the hunter beside you to cover your back. You pressed attacks that should be suicidal because you knew 5 other warriors were pressing with you, coordinated, synchronized, unstoppable. Cragg's hand dropped to his side. The signal was complete. Every hunter knew his role. Every weapon was ready. Every muscle coiled to strike. Brock was his younger brother by 3 winters. Stockier than Cragg, if that was possible. With a scar running from his left ear to his jaw where a wolf had nearly torn his face off when he was 16, Brock didn't speak. Much never had, even as a child, but he communicated through action. Through loyalty demonstrated in blood, through standing beside Cragg in every fight, every hunt, every impossible moment. When Brock's children were born, Cragg had held them first. When Cragg's mate died during a harsh winter 7 years past, Brock had shared his own food, his own fire, his own family, to keep his brother from despair. They were more than brothers. They were 2 parts of the same weapon. THAR was different, quicker, more aggressive, always pushing for the risky play. He'd once tried to take down a cave bear alone because he thought he saw weakness. Nearly died. Still walked with a slight limp from where the bear's claws had raked his hip. But that aggression made him perfect for the western flank, where speed and audacity could turn a retreat into a slaughter. The other 3 hunters were younger, Makan and Vor, cousins and nephews, learning the old ways. Good fighters, strong, fast, but not yet tempered by the years of survival that had turned Cragg, Brock, and Tharn into walking nightmares. The Homo Sapiens group reached the exact center of the kill zone. Cragg's eyes swept his hunting party one final time. Brock ready. Tharn ready. The young ones ready. Every position perfect. Every angle covered. Every escape route blocked. This was what 350,000 years of evolution had created. Not the smartest predator. Not the most flexible. But perhaps the most perfectly coordinated killing machine that had ever walked on 2 legs. The lead. Homo sapiens warrior looked directly at Crag's position. Their eyes met across 30 feet of cold morning air, Crag roared, and 6 Neanderthals attacked as one.
The distance closed in under 2 seconds. Crag exploded from behind the boulder with a speed that violated everything the Homo sapiens expected. The heavy, muscular Neanderthal body wasn't built for marathon endurance, couldn't chase prey across open savanna for hours the way the graceful Homo sapiens could. But for 10 yards, 20 yards, 50 yards of explosive sprint, Crag was faster than a charging bear. His roar was still echoing off the limestone walls when his spear drove toward the lead. Homo sapiens warrior's chest. The warrior was good. Better than good, Zotlatel came up defensively in a move that showed years of combat experience. He twisted sideways, letting Crag's spear point slice past his ribs instead of through them. The flint edge opened a gash across his leather tunic. Blood appeared. Not enough. But Crag wasn't alone. Brock hit the second Homo sapiens like an avalanche. The stocky male with the club never saw him coming. Brock's approach was from the high ground, using the rising sun to blind him in the shoulder, punching through muscle and grating against bone. The man's scream cut through the morning air. His club fell from nerveless fingers. The Homo sapiens female with the knife reacted faster than anyone anticipated. She didn't freeze, didn't panic, just lunged at Dreg, the youngest of Crag's hunters, driving her blade toward his belly with practiced precision. Dreg barely got his spear down in time to deflect. The knife scored his forearm, first blood to the enemy. Chaos erupted across the kill zone. This was the mathematics of ambush predation. Studies of modern ambush hunters, lions, tigers, crocodiles showed the same pattern. The first 5 seconds determined everything. If the predator could eliminate 30 to 50% of prey in that initial explosion of violence, the rest would panic, scatter, become easy targets. If the prey survived the first rush, if they rallied and fought back, the predator's advantage evaporated. Crag knew he had seconds to break them. His second thrust was aimed lower, at the lead warrior's thigh, trying to cripple mobility. The warrior deflected with his spear shaft, wood cracking against wood. Then he countered with a speed that shocked Crag. The outlet-thrown spear lanced toward Crag's face. Crag jerked his head aside. The point split the air inches from his eye. Too fast. These Homo sapiens were too fast. Around them, the battle fragmented into individual duels of desperate violence. Tharn had cut off the western escape route and was grappling with the nervous male who'd been watching the rear. They went down together in a tangle of limbs. Tharn's hands found the Homo sapiens' throat, squeezed. The man's eyes bulged. His fingers clawed at Tharn's face, digging for eyes. The injured Homo sapiens Melthawan Crag had marked as easy prey proved anything but, fought like a cornered wolf, his spear darting and thrusting with economical precision that suggested a lifetime of making every movement count. Makin was bleeding from 3 shallow cuts, circling, unable to find an opening. The juvenile Homo sapiens ran. Smart. Survival instinct overriding pride. He bolted for the river, splashing into the shallows. Vor pursued, his longer stride closing the distance. 20 feet 15. 10 then, the older female, the one Crag, had dismissed as non-combatant through a rock the size of a fist with brutal accuracy. It caught Vor in the temple. He dropped like a felled tree, unconscious before he hit the ground. Maybe dead, first loss. Crag felt it like a physical blow, but there was no time to process, no moment to grieve. The lead warrior was pressing the attack, using his spear's greater length to keep Crag at distance. Every time Crag tried to close, the warrior danced back, resetting range. Denying the grappling distance where Neanderthal strength became absolute, he'd fought Neanderthals before, knew their tactics, knew their weaknesses. Crag feinted left, then exploded right. Got inside the spear's reach. His free hand shot out, grabbing for the warrior's wrist. If he could just get a grip, the warrior dropped his otlot and pulled a stone knife in a motion too quick to follow. The blade opened Crag's forearm from elbow to wrist. Hot blood poured down his hand, making his spear grip slick. Pain came later. Action came first. Crag's headbutt caught the warrior square in the face. bone crunched. The warrior staggered back, nose fountaining blood. But he didn't fall, didn't drop his knife. Just reset his stance and came forward again. Slower now, more cautious, still fighting. 2 crags left. Brock had finished his first opponent and was moving to engage a second. Stocky male with the club wasn't getting up. Brock's spear had found something vital. 1 enemy down for certain. The female with the knife had opened Dreg's belly. Not deep, but deep enough. Dreg's hands were pressed to the wound, trying to hold his insides inside. He was out of the fight. 20 seconds had elapsed. 3 Homo sapiens down or wounded. 2 Neanderthals down or wounded. 5 Homo sapiens still fighting. The initial ambush had failed to break them, and now it was a brawl. It was close quarters, brutal. No tactics left, just violence and will, and the question of who wanted to live more. Crag's spear thrust caught the lead warrior in the side knot, a killing blow. Glancing off ribs, but enough to make him grunt and give ground. Crag pressed forward, sensing weakness. His strength was still intact. His muscles weren't tiring. He could fight for hours if needed, powered by the massive caloric engine burning in his chest. But the warrior wasn't retreating. He was repositioning, and Crag realized too late that he'd been hurted. Maneuvered into the open, away from the rocks, into clear ground where the other Homo sapiens could use their projectiles. The older female's second rock took Crag in the shoulder. The impact was stunning. His left arm went numb. His spear dipped. The lead warrior's eyes lit with predator recognition. He lunged, and Crag understood with perfect clarity that he'd underestimated them. These weren't prey, they were hunters, just like him. And somewhere in the chaos, Crag heard his brother's scream. Brock's scream cut through the battle chaos like a blade through flesh. Crag's head snapped toward the sound. His brother was on the ground, struggling beneath 2 Homo sapiens, the injured male and one of the females. They weren't trying to overpower him. They were using their bodies as weights, pinning his arms, keeping him immobile while the female positioned. A stone knife over his throat. Coordinated. Practiced. Tactical. The lead warrior saw Crag's attention split. Saw the moment of distraction. He moved instantly, his spear driving toward Crag's exposed side. Only instinct saved Crag. He twisted, taking the thrust on his hip instead of his kidney. The flint point scraped bone. Pain exploded white-hot through his body. Crag grabbed the spear shaft before the warrior could withdraw. Yanked hard. The warrior came with it, pulled off balance by Neanderthal strength that couldn't be resisted. Crag released his own spear and got both hands on the Homo sapiens. One hand clamped on the warrior's wrist, the other locked around his throat. Now it was a wrestling match. And in wrestling, Neanderthals had no equal. The warrior's eyes went wide as Crag's fingers tightened. The grip that could crack walnuts began crushing his windpipe. He clawed at Crag's face with his free hand, fingers digging for eyes, drew blood from Crag's cheek. It didn't matter. Crag had been clawed by cave lions. A human's fingernails were nothing. The warrior did something unexpected. Instead of pulling away from Crag's grip, he drove forward, using his momentum to unbalance Crag's stance. His knee came up, slamming into Crag's wounded hip. The pain was blinding. Crag's grip loosened for just an instant. An instant was enough. The warrior twisted free, gasping, his throat bruised purple. But he was still moving. Still fighting? He rolled away and came up with his knife, circling, keeping distance. His breath ragged, but his eyes clear. Crag had crushed that throat with enough force to kill most men. This one was still standing. Anthropologists studying. Homo sapiens' skeletal structure would one day marvel at the adaptations. Lighter bones, 30% less dense than Neanderthals, but more flexible, harder to break. Longer limbs providing better leverage for throws and strikes. Narrower hips, allowing faster running speeds. More efficient cooling systems permitting sustained exertion in ways the massively muscled Neanderthal body couldn't match. Where Neanderthals were built like wrestlers, compact, powerful. Designed to grapple and crush Homo sapiens were built like boxers. Light, fast, mobile, dancing in and out of range. Using speed and endurance to wear down stronger opponents. And they were learning to use tools, in ways Neanderthals never had. The female who'd been helping pin Brock suddenly rolled away. In her hand was a length of leather cord. She whipped it around Brock's ankle and pulled. Simple. Effective. Using leverage instead of strength. Brock crashed face first into the dirt. Before he could recover, the injured male drove his spear down toward Brock's back. Tharn saved him. Came out of nowhere, his massive shoulder catching the injured male in the chest, driving him sideways. The spear missed. Barely. Tharn's momentum carried both of them into the river shallows. They went under together, thrashing, water exploding around them. Crag tried to reach his brother. The lead warrior blocked his path, knife-weaving patterns in the air, forcing Crag to give ground or take cuts. Shallow slices opened on Crag's arms. His chest. Nothing deep. Nothing immediately threatening, but bleeding him. Weakening him. Death by 1,000 cuts. This was Homo Sapiens warfare. They didn't need to overpower. Just outlast, Makan had finally killed his opponent, the nervous male who'd been watching the rear. But it had cost him. He was moving slowly, favoring broken ribs. Blood matted his hair from a scalp wound. When the juvenile Homo Sapiens, the one who'd fled to the river, emerged behind him with a rock, Makan didn't see it coming. The rock caught him at the base of the skull. Makan went down and didn't get up. 2 Neanderthal hunters down for certain now. Maybe 3 if Vor was dead from the temple strike. The mathematics had shifted. 6 Neanderthals at the ambush start. Now, 3 fighting Crag. Brock Tharn. Maybe 2 if Brock couldn't break free from the female's cord. 8 Homo Sapiens at the start. For dead or wounded badly enough to be out of the fight. For still engaged, even numbers. But the Homo Sapiens had the momentum now. They'd survived the ambush. Survived the initial rush. Adapted, coordinated, turned. The Neanderthal advantage of strength and surprise into a grinding battle of attrition. And Homo Sapiens were better at attrition. Crag's breath was coming harder now. Not from exhaustion, his massive cardiovascular system could sustain combat for hours, but from blood loss. His forearm wound was still pumping. His hip was leaking. The shallow cuts across his torso were adding up. Nothing fatal alone, but together they were draining his power. The lead warrior saw it too. Saw Crag slowing. Saw the blood pooling at his feet. The warrior's tactics shifted. Less defensive circling, more aggressive pressing. Testing Crag's reactions. Probing for the moment when loss of blood would make those reactions too slow. Across the kill zone, Brock finally broke free. Snapped the leather cord with pure muscle, roared his fury, and charged the female who bound him. She ran, smart. Didn't try to stand and fight against a berserk Neanderthal. Just fled toward her companions, leading Brock into a position where 2 other Homo Sapiens could flank him. Brock saw the trap too late. A spear took him in the side, low, angled up under his ribs. Not immediately fatal, but crippling. He dropped to one knee, his hand pressed to the wound. Blood poured between his fingers. Dark blood. Liver or kidney, his eyes found Crag across 30 feet of blood-soaked ground. And Crag saw his brother dying. The rage that filled him was older than words. Older than fire. Older than tools. It was the fury of protection that lived in bones and blood, in the deepest parts of the brain, where brother meant more than self, where family was worth any price. Any sacrifice, any ending. Crag forgot tactics. Forgot pain. Forgot everything except getting to Brock. He charged straight at the lead warrior. Didn't try to feint, didn't try to maneuver. Just lowered his shoulder and drove forward like a battering ram. The warrior's knife opened Crag's shoulder. Crag didn't feel it. His hands found the warrior's chest. Shoved. Neanderthal strength, undiluted, explosive. The warrior flew backward. Hit the ground 8 feet away. His head cracked against stone. He lay still. Down. Maybe dead. Crag didn't care. He ran to Brock, dropped beside him. His hands found the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, knowing it was hopeless. Knowing liver wounds killed slowly and agonizingly, and there was nothing he could do, Brock's hand gripped Crag's wrist. His eyes were clear despite the pain. He was trying to say something, trying to tell his brother what? To run? To fight? To survive? The words never came. A Homo Sapiens spear took Crag from behind, driven with both hands, punching through the muscle of his lower back. Not his spine missing it by inches, but deep enough to anchor. Crag tried to turn. Couldn't. The spear was lodged, holding him pinned like a butterfly on display. The younger Homo Sapiens female stood behind him, both hands still on the spear shaft, her face twisted with effort and terror and triumph. She'd just killed a Neanderthal. Crag's hand found his stone axe, ripped it from his belt, swung blindly backward, felt it connect with something, heard a scream. The pressure on the spear released. He pulled forward. The spear shaft scraped against vertebrae but came free. He turned, axe raised, ready to finish her. She was already running. Smart. Always so smart. These Homo Sapiens. The battle was ending. Tharn had killed the injured male in the river, but taken wounds doing it. He was crawling toward shore, bleeding from a dozen places. The remaining Homo Sapiens were retreating, collecting their wounded. Disappearing into the forest, they'd survived. More than survived. They'd won. Crag knelt beside Brock in the blood-soaked dirt. His brother's breathing was shallow, rapid. His face was pale. The wound in his side bubbled with each breath. Lung punctured. Minutes left? Maybe. Not ours. Around them, the kill zone was silent, except for the dying. 3 Homo Sapiens bodies. 2 Neanderthal bodies for certain VO and Makan. Maybe a third Sundrag was unconscious, his belly wound still bleeding despite his hands pressed against it. Crag had killed 3 enemies. Lost 3 brothers. The mathematics of extinction didn't care about courage. Didn't care about strength. Didn't care about 350,000 years of evolution. It only cared about numbers. And the Neanderthals didn't have enough. Brock died as the sun reached its highest point. Crag held him through the final minutes. One hand pressed uselessly against the wound, the other gripping his brother's hand. Brock's eyes stayed on Crag's face until the very end. He tried to speak several times. His lips moved. His throat worked. But only blood came out, dark blood, thick, pumping weaker with each heartbeat until it finally stopped. When the light went out of Brock's eyes, something broke in Crag that would never heal. He knelt there beside his brother's body as the sun crossed the sky. Didn't move. Didn't speak. Around him, Tharn was tending his own wounds with shaking hands. Dreg had stopped breathing an hour after the battle ended, his belly wound festering too quickly, infection claiming him before blood loss could. 3 dead. Vor Makan Dreg. Young men with families waiting. With children who would grow up without fathers, with mates who would keen their grief into the night for weeks to come. And Brock, his brother. His right hand, the person Crag trusted more than anyone alive. Gone because Crag had led them into an ambush that should have worked. Should have been a massacre. Should have wiped out the Homo Sapiens group in 5 seconds of overwhelming violence. Instead, they'd fought back, adapted, survived. The Homo Sapiens had left 5 bodies behind the stocky male with the club. The nervous male Tharn had drowned. 2 others who'd taken fatal wounds in the initial rush. A good kill count. In any normal hunt, this would be victory. 5 enemies dead. The valley secured. Territory defended. But 5 other Homo Sapiens had escaped. Wounded? Yes. Traumatized, certainly. But alive. And alive meant they would return to their clan, would share what they'd learned, would teach others how Neanderthals fought and how to counter it, and more would come. They always came. More and more, pushing north from the warm lands, spreading across the valleys and forests that had been. Neanderthal home for longer than memory could reach. Crag finally stood. His body was a map of agony, the spear wound in his back that made every breath fire, the gash on his forearm that wouldn't stop seeping, the deep bruise on his hip where bone had been scraped, his shoulder where the knife had opened him. A dozen smaller cuts, each one draining his strength. But physical pain was nothing compared to the emptiness, where Brock's presence used to be. Tharn limped over. His face was gray beneath the blood and dirt. His left eye was swollen shut. His breathing was shallow, broken ribs, probably. They looked at each other without speaking. What was there to say? They'd lost. Not the battle, but something deeper. Something that mattered more. The Neanderthal population across all of Europe was estimated at 5,002. 15,000 individuals. Archaeologists studying fossil distribution patterns would one day calculate these numbers with cold precision. Small groups scattered across a massive continent, family bands of 10 to 30 individuals rarely interacting with other groups, living their entire lives within a 100-mile radius. Compare that to Homo sapiens. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, flooding out of Africa in waves that never stopped coming. Groups that met and mingled, sharing innovations, spreading successful strategies across vast distances through trade networks and social connections. Neanderthals couldn't match. Every Neanderthal death was catastrophic. Every lost hunter meant skills and knowledge that might never be replaced. Every warrior who fell meant fewer defenders for the next attack. Every woman who died in childbirth meant fewer children to replace the generation being ground down by ice and hunger and endless conflict. The Homo sapiens could lose 50 people and recover in a generation. The Neanderthals could lose 5 and never recover at all. Cragg looked at the 3 bodies of his hunting party. Young men, strong, skilled, dead before they'd fathered enough children to replace themselves. Their bloodlines cut short. Their knowledge lost. This was the mathematics of extinction. Not dramatic. Not sudden. Just arithmetic grinding populations down. Year after year, generation after generation, until the numbers reached 0, and the numbers were already catastrophically low. Cragg's body required 4,000 calories every day. During times of plenty, mammoth herds stretched across the tundra, and reindeer migrated in uncountable numbers. This was manageable. Neanderthals thrived. Their strength made them supreme hunters. But for the past 5,000 years, the climate had been shifting. Ice sheets advancing. Megafauna populations declining. The great herds that had sustained Neanderthals for hundreds of thousands of years were disappearing. And the Homo sapiens were hunting them too. Adding pressure to populations already stressed by environmental change, Cragg was hungry. Always hungry now. Even after successful hunts. Even after kills that would have left him satisfied a generation ago. His body burned through calories like fire through dry grass, and there was never enough fuel. He looked at the Homo sapiens' bodies, smaller, leaner, built for efficiency rather than power. They could survive on half the food Cragg needed. Could spread into territories where resources were too scarce to support Neanderthal populations. They were adapted for scarcity. Neanderthals were adapted for abundance, and abundance was ending. Cragg heard something that turned his blood to ice. Voices in the distance. Dozens of them. Calling to each other through the trees. The escaped Homo sapiens had returned to their main group. Were bringing reinforcements. They weren't running away anymore. They were coming back. Coming to finish what they'd started. Tharn heard it too. His good eye met Craig's. Question was unspoken but clear. Fight or flee. 3 days ago, Cragg would have chosen fight. Would have gathered every warrior from his clan and met the Homo sapiens in battle. Defended his territory to the last breath because this valley was his. Earned through generations of blood and survival. But Brock's body lay at his feet. Vors, Makans, dregs. For men who would never hunt again. For men whose children were now fatherless. 4 holes torn in his clan that could never be filled. And somewhere to the north, in caves Cragg had used as emergency shelter during the worst winters, was Nira. His mate, his children. The dozen other members of his family group who depended on him to keep them alive. If he died here defending territory, they died too. The voices were getting closer. Cragg could hear weapon shafts rattling. Footsteps. Many footsteps. He made the hardest decision of his life. We run, he said. They ran through the night and into the next day. North, always north, away from the valleys filling with Homo sapiens. Toward the marginal lands where ice still clung to the mountain slopes and game was scarce and survival was a daily knife edge. Toward the places even Homo sapiens didn't want. Crag moved through a fog of pain and exhaustion. The spear wound in his back had stopped bleeding, but not healing. Each step sent lightning through his spine. His breath came in ragged gasps. Tharn was worse, limping badly, one arm hanging useless, his face the color of snow. They should have stopped. Should have rested. Should have tended their wounds, but the Homo sapiens were following. Not immediately behind them. Crag had that much tactical sense left. He'd led them through streams to break the scent trail, across rocky ground that left no tracks, through dense thickets where pursuers would have to move slowly. But they were back there somewhere. Patient, persistent, waiting for Crag to weaken enough to make mistakes. It took 6 days to reach the northern caves where Crag had left his family. 6 days of gnawing hunger because they couldn't stop long enough to hunt properly. 6 days of sleeping in turns, never more than an hour, always listening for pursuit. 6 days watching Tharn's wounds fester and fever set in, knowing there was nothing Crag could do except keep moving, when they finally stumbled into the narrow valley that held the cave system. Crag's relief lasted exactly as long as it took to see the entrance. Empty. Cold. No smoke from fires. No sounds of children. No smell of cooking meat gone. Crag's legs gave out. He collapsed at the cave mouth, staring into the darkness. Tharn sat heavily beside him, his breathing labored and wet. Neither spoke. Crag forced himself to crawl inside. His eyes adjusted to the gloom. There were signs of recent habitation fire pits with old ashes, sleeping areas still indented where bodies had rested, tools left behind that were broken or worn beyond use, and bones. Old bones picked clean. Too many bones. The remnants of meals stretched over weeks, maybe months. They'd eaten everything. Exhausted every food source in the area. Then moved on, looking for better hunting grounds, or fled. Crag found scratches on the cave wall. Deliberate marks. A message left in the symbolic language Neanderthals had developed to communicate across time and distance. Simple image as a group of people. An arrow pointing west. Marks indicating moon cycles. 2 moons ago, his family had abandoned this place and headed toward the setting sun. Toward territories he didn't know. Toward lands that might already be claimed by other. Neanderthal groups, or invaded by Homo sapiens, or simply empty of the resources needed to survive. They were ghosts. Now, scattered. Desperate. Crag sat in the abandoned cave as sunset painted the valley in blood-red light. The mathematics of his situation were brutally clear. His hunting party was destroyed. His territory was lost. His family was dispersed. His body was breaking down from wounds that weren't healing properly because there wasn't enough food to fuel repairs. He was 32 years old. In Neanderthal terms, that made him an elder. Most males didn't survive past 40. The injuries accumulated too quickly. The hunts took too much. The winters were too harsh. Even without Homo sapiens competition, Neanderthal life was a slow grind toward death, but his children might be alive. Might be surviving somewhere to the west. If he could find them, if he could recover, if he could somehow protect them against the tide that was swallowing everything he'd ever known, population genetics, research would one day reveal the cruel truth. Neanderthal populations had never been large geographic isolation and slow. Reproduction kept numbers low even during optimal conditions. But for the past 50,000 years, those populations had been in freefall. Climate change, reducing megafauna, competition with Homo sapiens for remaining resources, territories fragmenting into smaller and smaller pockets. The genetic diversity was collapsing. Small populations meant inbreeding. Inbreeding meant reduced fitness. Reduced fitness meant fewer surviving children. Fewer surviving children meant smaller populations. The death spiral accelerated with each generation. Mathematical models showed it with pitiless clarity. Even if individual Neanderthals were stronger, smarter, or better adapted than Homo sapiens, it didn't matter. Homo sapiens had faster maturation, well up to 13 years to reproductive age versus 15 plus 4 Neanderthals. They had more flexible social structures that allowed populations to grow 2 to 3% annually. They could absorb catastrophic losses and recover. Neanderthals couldn't. Every loss was permanent. Every death moved them closer to the edge, and they were running out of edges to stand. Craig heard something outside the cave. His hand went to his spear, broken now. The shaft cracked during the flight north, only useful as a club. Tharn struggled to his feet, swaying. Neither had the strength for another fight, but when the shape appeared in the cave mouth, silhouetted against the dying sun, it wasn't Homo sapiens. It was Nura, his mate, his woman, the mother of his children. Her face was gaunt, her eyes haunted. Her body showed the same starvation that was eating Crag from the inside. But she was alive. Behind her, 2 small shapes. His children. A boy of 7 winters and a girl of 4. Alive. Impossibly alive. Nira saw him and stopped. Her eyes took in his wounds, his weakness, the wreckage of the warrior she'd known. For a long moment, neither moved. Then she crossed the cave and collapsed into his arms. And Crag understood that survival took many forms. Territory didn't matter. Pride didn't matter. The old ways of fighting and dying for hunting grounds didn't matter. Only this mattered. Family, blood, the desperate hope that somewhere ahead, somehow, his children might survive, even if he did. The choice crystallized with perfect clarity. They would run. Keep running. Find marginal territories where Homo sapiens hadn't yet spread. Hide rather than fight. Survive rather than conquer. It wasn't the warrior's path. Wasn't the way his father had taught him. Wasn't the Neanderthal way at all. But the Neanderthal way was ending, and Crag would do anything, abandon any tradition, flee any territory, sacrifice any pride to give his children one more day. Outside, night fell, and somewhere in the darkness, the Homo sapiens were still coming. The retreat lasted 2 years. Not 2 years of travel, 2 years of endless displacement. Moving from valley to valley, cave to cave, always one step ahead of the Homo sapiens expansion. Always searching for territories where game still existed and competition wasn't yet overwhelming. 2 years of watching his children grow thin. 2 years of watching Nira's face harden into something Crag barely recognized. 2 years of becoming refugees in a land his ancestors had owned since before the ice. They traveled west first. Following the marks Nira had left, trying to reunite with the scattered remnants of their clan, they found empty caves, old fire pits, scattered bones that might have been animal or might have been something worse. No people, no family, just silence and the constant evidence that others had been here, had exhausted the resources, had moved on, or died. The landscape itself was changing. Crag had lived his entire life reading terrain, understanding the rhythm of seasons, knowing where mammoth would migrate and where reindeer would gather and where cave lions denned. That knowledge was becoming worthless. The herds were smaller each year. The migrations more erratic. The caves that should have offered shelter were already occupied by Homo sapiens groups, who drove them away with superior numbers. Winter came early that first year. Crag's group, himself, Nira, their 2 children, Tharn, and 3 others they'd found during the flight, huddled in a shallow cave, barely large enough for sleeping. The wind howled through gaps in the rock. Ice formed on the walls. The children cried from hunger and cold until they were too weak to cry anymore. Crag hunted every day. Sometimes he caught rabbits, sometimes birds. Once a young deer that had broken its leg and couldn't run. Never enough. Never close to the 4,000 calories his body demanded. He was burning through his own muscle now, his body cannibalizing itself to stay alive. His face was gaunt. His ribs showed. The massive shoulders that had once defined him were eroding away. Nira was worse. Her body had been designed by evolution to carry and nurse children through the harshest conditions imaginable. But design required fuel. Her milk had dried up months ago. Their youngest, the 4-year-old girl, was too weak to walk now. Nira carried her everywhere, a tiny bundle of bones wrapped in leather, clinging to life through sheer stubbornness. The boy, 7 winters old, was trying to become a hunter. Crag taught him to track, to move silently, to read signs in snow and mud. The boy learned quickly. Too quickly. Childhood was a luxury they couldn't afford anymore. At 7, he needed to contribute, or the group would starve. That was the mathematics of their new existence. Everyone had to produce more than they consumed, or the group shrank. And the group was already too small. They saw Homo sapiens constantly now. Distant campfires on hillsides, smoke rising from valleys. Groups moving through the forest with the confidence of people who owned the land. Sometimes Crag's group hid and watched them pass. Sometimes they fled before being detected. Once, they found a Homo sapiens camp that had been abandoned recently, still warm fires. Half-eaten food, tools left behind, they took everything. Scraped the bones for marrow. Ate scraps of meat that had been discarded. Took the tools, even though they were made differently from Neanderthal designs. Lighter and more refined in ways that spoke of different thinking, different hands, different minds. Crag held a Homo sapiens spear and marveled at its construction. The shaft was straighter than anything he could make. The point was hafted with a resin he didn't recognize. The balance was perfect. This wasn't just a weapon, it was evidence of knowledge systems that spread and improved across vast networks of people sharing innovations. Neanderthals made tools the way their fathers had, and their grandfathers, and their great-grandfathers reaching back through the millennia. The designs were ancient, proven, reliable, but static. Each group isolated, each family reinventing solutions their ancestors had already discovered. The Homo sapiens were different. They built on each other's knowledge. What one group invented spread to others. Their tools improved generation by generation. Their strategies evolved. Their networks grew. They were outthinking the Neanderthals even faster than they were outbreeding them. Tharn died in the spring. His wounds had never properly healed. Infection had settled deep in his bones, a rot that couldn't be cut out or cured. He lasted longer than he should, have Neanderthal toughness keeping him alive through months of fever and pain. But in the end, even that wasn't enough. They buried him in a shallow grave, covering his body with stones to keep scavengers away. Crag placed Tharn's favorite spear beside him. Nira laid flowers across his chest, spring blooms that had just emerged from the melting snow. Evidence from Shanidar Cave would one day show that Neanderthals had buried their dead with flowers for hundreds of thousands of years. A gesture that spoke of grief, of respect, of the belief that death wasn't quite the end. Crag stood over his cousin's grave and felt something break that he couldn't name. Not grief, he'd felt that when Brock died. This was deeper. This was the understanding that everything he'd been taught, everything he'd believed about strength and territory and the Neanderthal way of life, was dissolving like spring snow and rain. The strong didn't survive. The adaptable survived. And Neanderthals weren't adapting fast enough. They kept moving. South now, toward the warmer lands near the Great Sea. Other Neanderthal groups were retreating to the same. Marginal territories, the last refuges where game still existed and Homo sapiens hadn't yet dominated. Gibraltar, the Iberian caves. Isolated valleys in the mountains where ice still made travel difficult. Crag saw the evidence of their decline everywhere. Abandoned campsites with tools that showed declining quality ruffernapping, less refined hafting, knowledge eroding as populations shrank and elders died before passing on their skills. Graves that were too small children who hadn't survived their first winter. Cave paintings that were thousands of years old, made by ancestors who had lived in abundance. In a world where Neanderthals were supreme, that world was gone. Maybe gone forever. They reached the southern caves 2 years after the ambush that killed. Brock 2 years that felt like 20. Crag was 34 now, ancient by Neanderthal standards. His body was a catalog of injuries that would never fully heal. His shoulder where the knife had opened him. his back where the spear had punched through, his hip that ached with every step. Dozens of scars from dozens of fights, each one taking something he couldn't get back. But his children were alive. Against all probability, against all logic, they had survived. The caves were occupied. Other Neanderthal families, perhaps 20 individuals total, had gathered in this final refuge. They looked at Craig's group with hollow eyes, recognition of shared suffering, shared displacement, shared understanding that they were all running out of places to run. An old female ancient, maybe 45 winters. Her face, a map of wrinkles and scars, approached Craig. She studied him with eyes that had seen too much. Then she spoke in the deep, guttural tones of old Neanderthal language. "You're the last," she said. "From the northern valleys, we thought everyone was dead." Craig nodded. "Almost everyone is." She gestured to the caves. "You can stay. If you can hunt. If you can contribute. We don't carry the weak anymore. Can't afford to." It was the cruelest math Craig had ever heard spoken aloud, but it was true. In abundance, Neanderthals cared for. They're injured, they're elderly, they're disabled. The evidence was written in bones, individuals who survived years with catastrophic injuries because their groups fed them, protected them, valued them. But in scarcity, that compassion became unaffordable. Every mouth that ate without producing pushed the entire group closer to starvation. Craig looked at his daughter, still too weak to walk. Looked at his son, thin as a reed. Looked at Nira, whose body had been ground down by 2 years of running. "We'll contribute," Craig said. And they did. For months, they survived. Barely. Always hungry. Always cold. Always listening for the sounds of Homo Sapiens expansion creeping closer. Until one morning, Craig woke to find the caves empty again. During the night, without warning, the group had abandoned the site, taken everything portable, and vanished. Left Craig's family behind because they moved too slowly, consumed too much, contributed too little. The mathematics of extinction had no room for sentiment. Craig stood in the empty cave as dawn broke. Nira beside him, his children shivering in the cold. No food, no allies. No territory to call their own, just survival. One more day, then another, until there were no more days left. Craig saw her on a morning when frost still clung to the shadows and his breath made clouds in the air. A Homo Sapiens woman, alone. Walking through the valley below the caves with the careful steps of someone. Navigating unfamiliar terrain. She carried a gathering basket woven in a style Craig didn't recognize. Her clothing was different from the Homo Sapiens warriors he'd fought, softer leather, decorated with beads and shells. Speaking of peacetime crafts rather than combat preparation. And she wasn't alone. A child walked beside her, perhaps 3 or 4 winters old. Moving with the unsteady gait of early childhood, stopping frequently to examine rocks or plants, wandering in circles the way children did when the world was still new and fascinating. Craig's hand went to his spear automatically. The instinct was carved. Deep Homo Sapiens were enemies, threats. The force that had destroyed everything he'd known. His body remembered the ambush, remembered Brock dying, remembered 2 years of flight. But something stopped him from moving. Something about the child. The proportions were wrong. The child's build was stockier than typical Homo Sapiens' young, thicker chest, heavier limbs, broader skull. The brow ridge was pronounced. The face had that pushed forward quality that marked Neanderthal features. Even at a distance of 100 feet, even through morning mist, Craig could see it. That child carried Neanderthal blood. The woman noticed him. Froze, like prey spotting a predator. Her hand moved protectively to the child's shoulder, pulling the young one close. But she didn't run, didn't scream, just stood there, watching Craig watch her, waiting to see what the scarred Neanderthal warrior would do. Craig walked down the slope. Slowly, hands visible. Spear held low, non-threatening. The woman's eyes tracked his every movement. She was afraid he could smell it, sharp and acrid on the morning air. But she held her ground. When they were 20 feet apart, Craig stopped, studied the child more carefully. Male, probably. Face dirty, nose running, eyes bright with curiosity rather than fear. Looking at Crag the way children looked at anything interesting with open fascination. The child had his father's eyes, Neanderthal eyes, deep-set, heavy-browed, adapted for low light and long sight. Crag's throat was tight. He spoke in the old tongue, words that felt thick and ancient. The father? The woman didn't understand. Her language was the quick, flowing speech of Homo sapiens. Musical complex, full of sounds Crag's throat couldn't shape. But she understood the question in his tone. Her hand moved to her chest, then to the child, then made a gesture that Crag recognized the universal symbol for death, foregone, forended. The father was dead. Whether killed in hunting or war or simple accident didn't matter. What mattered was that this woman had chosen to keep the child, to raise a hybrid offspring rather than abandon it as some kind of between thing, neither fully her people nor fully his. Research that would emerge tens of thousands of years later would reveal the truth. Interbreeding between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens wasn't rare. It wasn't accidental. It happened repeatedly across thousands of years and thousands of miles. Sometimes through violence, sometimes through choice, sometimes through simple proximity when groups met at territorial boundaries and found common ground and shared humanity. The genetic evidence would be undeniable. Modern humans of European and Asian descent carried 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. 30,000 individual genetic variants, herited from Neanderthal ancestors. Genes affecting immune response, skin pigmentation, hair texture, cold tolerance. Genes that helped Homo sapiens survive in the harsh northern climates where Neanderthals had evolved for hundreds of millennia. The Neanderthals hadn't simply died. They'd been absorbed, integrated. Their genetic legacy spreading through the Homo sapiens population like water seeping into soil. Crag looked at the child and saw the future. Not his future, his bloodline would likely end with his own children, if they survived at all. But the future of Neanderthal genes, Neanderthal adaptations, Neanderthal strength flowing forward through hybrid offspring. Some Neanderthal groups must have made the choice. Must have looked at the overwhelming numbers of Homo sapiens and decided that fighting was suicide. Must have chosen integration over extinction. Chosen to join the groups that were winning, rather than die defending territories that couldn't be held. How many had made that choice? How many Neanderthal women had taken Homo sapiens mates? How many Neanderthal men had been accepted into Homo sapiens clans? How many children like the one standing before Crag now carried the last fragments of a dying species into the future? The archaeological record was silent on such personal decisions. Bones couldn't speak of love or pragmatism or desperate choices made in desperate times. But the DNA spoke clearly. The mixing had happened, frequently enough to leave permanent marks. The woman was watching Crag carefully. Her hand had moved to a knife at her belt, not drawn, but ready. She was small, even for Homo sapiens, barely reaching Crag's shoulder. No threat in direct confrontation. But she had something Crag didn't. She had a future. Her people were everywhere, growing, spreading, winning. Crag's people were dying in caves, scattered and alone. He could kill her, could take the child, could try to raise him in the old ways, teach him Neanderthal skills, pass on knowledge that was evaporating with every death. It's what the warrior in him demanded, what his father would have done, what the old ways required. But Crag had seen where the old ways led, to Brock's corpse, to Tharn's grave, 2 empty caves and abandoned territories and the slow dissolution of everything he'd known. The child was staring at him, reached out one chubby hand, fingers spread, wanting to touch the strange creature that looked almost but not quite like the people he knew. The woman pulled him back gently, but not frantically. Not with the horror of protecting her young from a predator, with caution, respect. The wariness you showed to something dangerous but not necessarily hostile. She saw him as human, different, other, but human nonetheless. Crag's hand loosened on his spear. The weapon suddenly felt impossibly heavy. All the fighting, all the killing, all the desperate defense of territories and traditions and the Neanderthal way of life, what had it accomplished? His people were still dying. His children were still starving. His culture was still eroding into dust. Maybe survival didn't mean fighting to the last breath. Maybe it meant something else. Something his warrior's heart found almost unbearable to contemplate. Maybe it meant letting go. He stepped back, raised his empty hand, made the gesture for peace, for safe passage, for leave and safety. The woman's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected mercy from a Neanderthal warrior. Hadn't expected anything but violence from a representative of the species her people were displacing. She nodded once, picked up her child, turned and walked away, moving quickly but not running, glancing back every few steps to make sure Crag wasn't following. Crag watched them disappear into the forest, watched the future walk away, carrying fragments of the past in its blood. When he returned to the cave, Nira was waiting. She'd seen the encounter from above, seen him spare the woman and child. Her eyes held questions she didn't ask. "They're winning," Crag said finally. "Not because they're stronger, because they're more. Because they can lose 10 and make 20. Because they don't need to be better, they just need to be enough." Nira was silent for a long moment. Then, "What do we do?" Crag looked at his own children. His son, trying so hard to be a hunter at 8 winters old. His daughter, finally strong enough to walk again, playing with stones near the cave entrance. The last of his bloodline. The last carriers of his name, his knowledge, his way of life. "We survive," he said. "However we can. For as long as we can. Even if survival meant becoming something other than what they'd been. Even if it meant the Neanderthals won by losing. Even if it meant living on only as ghosts in someone else's blood." Crag's son died in his 12th winter. A simple hunting accident. The kind that had claimed countless young Neanderthals over hundreds of thousands of years. The boy had been tracking a deer through heavy snow, moving too quickly, too eager to prove himself. The ice gave way beneath him. He fell into a ravine hidden by drifts. Broke his back against the rocks below. Crag found him 2 hours later. Still alive, still conscious, eyes clear and bright with pain, and the terrible understanding that this was the ending. The boy tried to speak, tried to tell his father something important, but the words came out as blood, and then he was gone. Crag carried his son's body back to the cave, dug a grave with hands that had grown old and stiff, placed the boy's first spear beside him crude, unbalanced, made when he was 7 winters old and still learning, covered him with stones, added flowers even though it was winter and he had to search for hours to find a few frozen, blooms clinging to sheltered rocks. Nira watched without speaking. Her face was stone. She'd stopped crying years ago, stopped showing emotion of any kind. Grief was a luxury, like compassion, like hope. Luxuries the dying couldn't afford. Their daughter was 10 winters old now, thin as a willow branch, quiet. She'd learned early that making noise attracted attention. She helped dig her brother's grave without complaint, her small hands moving stones, her face empty of everything except exhaustion. After the burial, Crag sat at the cave entrance and counted his losses. Everyone. He'd lost everyone. His father. Dead 30 years ago, crushed by a mammoth during a hunt gone wrong. His mother, dead in childbirth, trying to deliver a sister who never drew breath. His brother Brock, bleeding out in a kill zone 2 years past. His cousin Tharn, rotting from infected wounds. His son, broken at the bottom of a ravine. His entire hunting party. His entire clan. 350,000 years of unbroken lineage, and he was watching it end. He was 36 winters old, ancient beyond measure. His body was a ruin. The spear wound in his back had never healed properly, leaving him with a limp and constant pain. His shoulder barely moved anymore, frozen by scar tissue. His hands were twisted with arthritis from too many breaks that had healed wrong. His teeth were loose. His eyesight was failing. His breath came short and labored even at rest. He was dying. Slowly, inevitably. The way all Neanderthals died, ground down by accumulated damage, worn away by the brutal mathematics of survival in the harshest environment Earth could produce, But he'd survived longer than most, seen more than most, fought harder than most, and in the end, it had changed nothing. The Homo sapiens were everywhere now. Their campfires dotted every valley. Their hunting parties moved through forests that had been Neanderthal territory for longer than memory. They'd brought new tools, bone needles for sewing fitted clothing, spear throwers that made hunting more efficient, fish hooks that opened new food sources. They'd brought new strategies, trade networks, alliances between groups, organized warfare that could mobilize hundreds of warriors. They'd brought overwhelming numbers. The last Neanderthal sites would one day be dated by archaeologists using radiocarbon analysis. Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar, 40,000 years ago. Vindija Cave in Croatia, 42,000 years ago. Scattered sites across the Iberian Peninsula showing final populations, clinging to marginal refuges before disappearing entirely from the fossil record. Crag didn't know he was living through extinction. Didn't have the perspective to understand that he was among the last of his species. He only knew that everywhere he looked, his people were gone, placed, erased. The fire in the cave was burning low. Crag added wood, with movements that had become automatic over a lifetime. Watched the flames catch and grow. Fire had been the gift of his ancestors, controlled, maintained, carried from generation to generation for 400,000 years. Longer than the ice, longer than the megafauna, longer than almost anything except the stones themselves. Neanderthals had mastered fire when Homo sapiens were still in Africa, had used it to survive ice ages that should have been extinction events, had carried it into the darkest caves and the coldest winters. A piece of the sun held in human hands, and now that fire was going out. Not the flames in front of him, those would burn through the night, but the greater fire, the knowledge, the culture, the living presence of his people. Going out, going dark, going silent forever. Crag thought about the child he'd seen with the Homo sapiens woman. Wondered if that boy was still alive. Wondered if he'd grown strong, if the Neanderthal blood in his veins gave him advantages among his Homo sapiens peers. Wondered if he understood what he carried, the last fragments of a people who had ruled. Europe since before the ice? Probably not. Probably he just lived his life, one day after another, never thinking about the ghost blood flowing through him. Never knowing his distant father had been the end of a line stretching back 350 millennia. That was fine. That was enough. The blood would flow forward even if the name didn't. The genes would persist even if the culture died. Some part of the Neanderthals would survive, just not the part that mattered to Crag. Nira emerged from the cave's depths, sat beside him without speaking. They'd been together for 18 winters now, had made 2 children together, had survived impossible odds together, had watched everything they knew crumble together. She leaned against his shoulder. Her body was skeletal, her hair gray despite being only 32 winters old. She looked 50, looked ancient, looked like she'd lived 3 lifetimes of suffering compressed into 3 decades. "Are we the last?" she asked finally. Her voice was barely a whisper. Crag thought about it. Somewhere in the mountains, there might be other Neanderthal groups. Small families clinging to caves, surviving on what little game remained. Somewhere in the southern refuges, there might be communities that had found stability, had adapted, had figured out how to coexist with the Homo sapiens tide. But probably not. Probably those groups were dying too. Probably the extinction was happening everywhere at once. Not dramatic. It's not sudden. Just populations shrinking year by year until they reached zero. "Maybe not the last," Crag said, "but close." Nira nodded. She'd expected that answer. Our daughter? Their daughter, 10 winters old, too young to survive alone, too weak to contribute enough to earn protection from other groups if her parents died. Her future was measured in months, maybe weeks, unless there's a Homo sapiens settlement, Crag said slowly. 3 valleys south. Large group, maybe 50 people. I've watched them. They have children. They have food. They're organized. Nira understood immediately what he wasn't saying. You want to give her to them? I want her to live. The words hung in the cold air between them. This was the final surrender. Not just of territory or tradition, but of blood itself. Sending their last child into the arms of the people who'd destroyed everything that Neanderthals had been, but she would live. Probably, possibly, at least she'd have a chance. She has your eyes, Nira said. Your brow. They'll know what she is. I know. Crag's hand found Nira's. Their fingers in her lace-rough skin, broken nails. The hands of people who'd worked every day of their lives just to survive one more day. But maybe that doesn't matter anymore. Maybe they'll take her anyway. Maybe mercy existed in the world. Maybe the Homo Sapiens, for all their violence and displacement and overwhelming expansion, still had room in their hearts for a child who wasn't quite their own. Maybe it was a thin hope, but it was the only hope left. The fire crackled. Sparks rose into the darkness, bright for a moment, then gone. Like lives. Like bloodlines. Like entire species that had burned bright and fierce and then faded into nothing but memory and bones. Crag watched the flames and made his final decision. Tomorrow, we'd take his daughter south. Would approach the Homo Sapiens settlement. Would do what no Neanderthal warrior should ever do, beg for mercy from the enemy, would trade his pride for her. Survival would become something other than what he'd been. Tonight, though he sat with Nira by the fire and remembered his father teaching him to hunt, remembered Brock laughing at some long-forgotten joke, remembered Tharn's reckless courage, remembered his son's first successful rabbit kill, the pride in the boy's eyes, the moment when childhood became something harder and more necessary, remembered being Neanderthal when that still meant something. The fire burned through the night, and Crag sat watching it, the last hunter of a people who had survived 400,000 years of ice and darkness and endless hunger, survived everything except the arrival of people, who looked almost like them, but weren't. People. Who could adapt faster, breed faster, think in ways that built networks and innovations and unstoppable momentum. People would carry Neanderthal genes forward into a future that Neanderthals themselves would never see as the fire died to embers. Crag saw shapes in the coals, faces everyone he'd loved, everyone he'd lost. They flickered in the red glow, almost real, almost solid, and for just a moment, one final moment, they were all together again. Then the wind shifted, and they were gone. The museum is quiet. Footsteps echo on polished floors. Families move past displays, children pressing faces to glass. Adults reading labels with casual interest. In the center of the room, behind reinforced glass and environmental controls, a skeleton lies in eternal rest. The label reads, Homo Neanderthalensis. Extinct approximately 40,000 years ago, the bones are thick, robust, built for strength that modern humans can barely comprehend. The skull is large, heavy-browed, housing a brain that saw the world in ways we'll never fully understand. These were the bones of warriors, of survivors, of people who mastered Europe for 350,000 years. They live in us still, in our immune systems, in our skin, in the genes that help us survive cold and altitude and disease. Every person with European or Asian ancestry carries them fragments of Crag and Nira and Brock and Tharn, scattered through our DNA like stars across darkness. The Neanderthals didn't simply die, they became us. Their fire still burns in our blood. Outside, the city moves on. Inside, the bones wait, remembering.